Hello and welcome. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. We are decoding the deception as we journey through the book of Acts. We're here in the 21st chapter, and we've talked about this in the past couple videos, but it is interesting that this last section of the book of Acts covers, if you just count words, text, pages, whatever you want to do, it covers a large part of the book. The book is 28 chapters, and you have this journey home taking up more than 7 of those chapters. Not the journey home, the journey to Jerusalem and then to Rome. We are, just because of the way we tend to read things, it's kind of narrative. We cruise through it, and I know I'm speaking for myself when I say I have not given enough thought to what all we learn about Paul's missionary journey, not his missionary journeys, but his return back to Jerusalem and then off to Rome. This is the thumbnail from the video immediately preceding this, with Paul sailing toward, not Jerusalem, but he eventually gets to Jerusalem. And so now, today, we pick up with him actually being at Jerusalem and what transpires here. We're going to try to look at it carefully and see what all there is for us to learn. So when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles throughout his ministry. When they heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs." We'll stop there. You can see that things are going to get interesting. Now, did you catch anything as we started to read here? Something we've been working on calling out and paying attention to. We've got more we passages here. Luke is still with him, and when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. So they're finally back to Jerusalem. Luke and this group of companions are with Paul, and who do they go to see? When they come to Jerusalem, they go to see James. And who is James? The last time we saw James was in Acts 15. And what transpires in Acts 15? Acts 15 is the Jerusalem Council, the council at Jerusalem, however you want to refer to it. And there, James was obviously the leader of the church. Who is this James? Good question. Who is this James? Here he's spoken of as just everybody would know who he is. We see James and we think what? Peter and Andrew, James and John. No, not that James. That James died at the beginning, early part of the book of Acts. He was executed by Herod. So who is this James? This James is the half-brother, whatever you want to call it, of Jesus. He is the James who writes the epistle of James. He's the James who became the head of the church in Jerusalem. And if you're the head of the church in Jerusalem, I don't think that they were too preoccupied with power and authority and all those things in the sense that develops later. And you've got the papacy and the Eastern Orthodox Church and the church at Rome, the church at Constantinople and the split and all those things. But if you're the leader of the church in Jerusalem, that's a very important position. Now, why James? Let's just talk about that. Why wouldn't it be John? Why wouldn't it be Peter? Why wouldn't it be those guys? What was their job? They were sent. They were apostles. We need to remember that these titles had meaning. Apostle is a sent one who is sent. Jesus sent them. They were the ones who were to carry the message, all points of the compass, fanning out in all directions. And if you think of Jerusalem and arrows going out from it, 12 different arrows, 360 degrees, and it ends up being 13 because of the Apostle Paul, brought in later as an apostle, one sent by Jesus Christ. They're all gone. Their job was to leave. Their job was to go and teach the faith all around the world, to spread the gospel. So that leaves a leadership vacuum. And James is the one who stepped into that position, who was recognized as being the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And we're not told how that happened. We're not given the details. I will just say this. Do you know how you recognize a leader? How do they rise to the top? You want to think about it in that way. Leaders lead. Everybody knows who the leader is. You want to know who the leader is? Let everything go wrong and see who everyone turns to. Or when they speak, everyone listens and says, okay, yeah, that's what we're going to do. Whether they voted, whatever they did, drew, cast lots, we're not told. We're not told. And on that in its own, it is interesting. What does the scriptures say about church? Well, I'll use the word polity. That's the fancy term. The term politics related to it, right? But comes from the same root. What do the scriptures say about church politics and how it's supposed to be done? How things are supposed to be carried out and done? Next to nothing. Next to nothing. There is no papacy established. That is sheer and utter manufactured nonsense. There is no papacy. There's no set order of how things are supposed to be done. The church is to be run and organized, whether it's a congregation or a group of congregations, however believers choose to organize and operate, there Jesus is with them. And how they choose their pastors, how they choose the elders, all those things, it's left up to them. There is no set, this is how you do it. In whatever box you may exist in, if you exist in a box. When I talk about box, I'm thinking about a theological construct. You tend to think this is the way it's supposed to be done. Why? Well, because that's the way it's always been done. Doesn't mean it's the way it's supposed to be done. There is no supposed to be done way. And yes, that was a grammatical disaster. But believers are left to be led by the Lord in doing things decently and in good order. Order matters. Structure does matter. The problem, we're going to use an analogy here. The problem with structure is, and there's always going to be problems with structure. You know why? Because the structure is composed of sinful human beings, and sinful human beings make a mess out of things. There are always challenges, always struggles. The problem with focusing and putting great importance on the structure is structure, and instead of structure, I'm going to call it bureaucracy. Okay? Bureaucracy exists to make sure that bureaucracy continues to exist. What's the problem with government? Bureaucracy exists so that to make sure that bureaucracy continues to exist. Once a new office of once a new department of gets created, you know what it never does, ever. It never goes away. It's there forever. Those who hold those positions are going to defend their turf with all their might. Okay? And if you think that doesn't go on in the church, then you haven't been very involved in the church. Okay? Because it does. Whether it's at the congregational level, whether it is at the church body, the national, regional level, that is what happens. Okay? It's just the way it is. So, all of that started by talking about James. Why was James the leader? We don't know for sure, but James was a leader and people would follow him and listen to him. And he was a faithful guy. James and all the elders were present. So Paul has been gone. Think of it. If you think of the map, and maybe we'll pop one up here because, well, it's a map. And anytime we get to open a map here at Decoding the Deception, we do that. Now, I'm not going to hunt for the right maps because it doesn't matter. The last time they saw Paul here in Jerusalem was at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. First missionary journey is Acts 13 and 14, right? Okay. Since then, since the Jerusalem Council, Paul has been all through here, all the way through here, all the way back through here, and then back again. He's covered all this territory, all of the churches that we think of, right? Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus, and more, Berea, all of those places Paul has been. And remember the time, remember the setting. No email, no websites. You can have a missionary now out in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, and every now and then they're able to post pictures and articles and talk about the work that they're doing, and whoever's supporting them all around the world can see those photos, right? Not then. Was Paul in communication with them to some degree? Probably. But with how Paul was spending all his time, if it came to reporting back to Jerusalem to let them know what was going on, or taking time to write 2 Thessalonians, what do you think Paul was going to do? And besides which, Paul didn't answer to Jerusalem. Paul had been sent out on all his missionary journeys by the church where? Church where? The church up here in Antioch, where that little hand is, right there. He'd been sent out by them. Now he's come to Jerusalem, and he's going to report to them everything that he had done. How long do you think that took? Can you imagine that conversation? How fascinating it would have been to hop in a time machine, go back, be a fly on the wall, and listen to Paul describing everything that had happened on his second and third missionary journeys. And now he's back here in Jerusalem and related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles. Don't miss that. We're going to make it so you can't miss it. Among the Gentiles through his ministry. Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles. Who are the Gentiles? The Gentiles, it's everybody who's not a Jew. The nations. Yeah, that theme. Again, the reclamation of the nations. The restoration of the original order of all things that will be consummated in full on that last day when Jesus calls out all of those from the nations who have heard the word, who are now all part, once again, of God's family. So Paul has been preaching to the Gentiles. Now, we've shown how Paul always went to the Jews first. He did. He never skipped the Jews. He always went to the synagogue and taught there. And we've seen how that went. There would be some believers, and then opposition would arise. And in every place, if you go back, and of course, I highly recommend this, going back and reading the book of Acts. But if you read the second missionary journey, the first, second, third missionary journeys, the opposition always came from the Jews. They were the ones who would stir people up. They were at least involved in major roles in stirring the people up against Paul. It never stops. It is inescapable. And that theme makes much of the New Testament incorrect, because there are some things you're not allowed to say in this modern day. And what I just said is one of them. Always the Jews. It was always the Jews opposing and standing up against the gospel. Now, there were believing Jews who became Christians, but they were Christian Jews. But Paul was a missionary, an apostle to the Gentiles. So he's back where? In Jerusalem. Do you think in Jerusalem that the majority of the believers who were there were Jews or Gentiles? Yeah, they were Jews. And we're going to see that. And there is this cultural thing that happens that was a real challenge. We think, because you and I are here in this latter day, and we've existed in Christendom, where everybody's a Christian. If you're in the church, you're a Christian. We don't talk, there are the Jews for Jesus thing and that stuff, but it's very small. We're Christians. The whole Old Testament thing, that's gone and done. We don't observe Passover just for a cultural observance. We don't do the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Weeks, unleavened bread, any of that stuff. We don't do it. It's gone. It's done. It's all been fulfilled. Those things, Paul tells the Colossians, were but a foreshadowing of that which is to come. Jesus fulfilled it all. Everything in the Old Testament, all the promises, all the things they looked forward to, he fulfilled. And so for us, it's done. And so Paul says, let no one judge you by a new moon, a festival, a Sabbath. Those are all a foreshadowing. The reality, the fulfillment, the real thing is in Christ, right? I always put it this way. Who wants to watch a preview? In chatting with some people beforehand, we'd seen a meme about Jaws. Who wants to watch a preview to the movie Jaws, which came out in, I think, 1977? I've seen the movie multiple times. It came out in 1977. Why watch a preview? I've got the real thing. I don't need to watch a preview of It's a Wonderful Life. I can tell you the whole story. I've seen it. I know it. Okay. I don't need, in the same sense, the preview of, now I'm not saying we don't need the Old Testament, because there's so much there that we learn, and you really can't understand the New Testament if you don't understand the Old. But as far as our salvation, it's all been fulfilled in Christ Jesus. And that's Paul. That's Paul preaching to the Gentiles, bringing that message. So he tells them about the Gentiles, and when they heard it, they glorified God. Amazing. Awesome. Probably blew their minds. They knew Paul was having success, the degree to which he had success. And he's got what? This group of people who are with him, who are representatives of the different parts of the world where he'd spread the gospel. It had to be a real celebration. And when they heard it, they glorified God and said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed." They're in Jerusalem, and we'd seen it before. We definitely saw it when Jesus was here. There were converts to Christianity. They recognized the Messiah, and they're in that setting. They didn't see themselves probably, and I'm speculating here, as not being Jewish. They were just Jews who recognized the Messiah. He came, and now they know him. And yeah, that changed a lot of things, but there were things that didn't change. Because this can get confusing for us. Read through it again and we'll talk about it. "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done?" This is James speaking here. He's concerned. "They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality." And then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. Okay, we've got to do some work here to get our minds around this, because in our minds, all this stuff about the Old Testament, the law, and what does it mean? We could spend a whole video on this. The law. You hear the law, and I'm not going to tell you what you hear. Think about it for a moment. You hear law, and what comes to mind? What does that term, if you're in a Bible class in college, New Testament theology, Old Testament theology, and that word, it says define the following terms. The law. Define the law. What would you say that is? What is the law? Is it the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments? Is it the Torah? Both of those are valid answers. The term the law is used in all kinds of different ways. Okay. Does it mean the entirety of the Old Testament? Because there are many places where it's used for that. The law is the entirety of the New Testament. What is the law? And exactly what is going on here? Because from everything Paul has done and taught, and we would think that all this stuff's in the past about circumcising kids and walking according to our customs. And what does that mean, walking according to our customs? What does that mean? Do you think that the Jewish Christians, the believers, we'll call them the Jewish believers in Jerusalem, were still observing the Passover? Do you think that they were still going to the temple? Do you think they were observing other festivals? Obviously, they were circumcising the little boys. What was going on here? And the answer to all those questions is yes, they were observing all those things. And as far as what the law is, had their understanding of the law changed? Yeah. But we could go into this at great length because our understanding of what they thought of as observance of the law is different than what it really was, probably for faithful people. We'll go down that road for just a moment. Elizabeth and Zechariah, as we record this, we're in the Christmas season. Elizabeth and Zechariah, parents of John the Baptist, it said they were blameless as far as keeping the law. What does that mean? Do you think that Zechariah, the priest, Zechariah thought that he was saved because he observed the law? I don't think he did. I don't think he did. Do you think he thought he was perfect? No, I don't think he did. They understood that all, and you read what he says about his son when he finally gets to speak after he's been made mute for 9 months. I think that he knew full well what all the sacrifices pointed ahead to. Good, faithful, well-informed, educated Jews like Mary go read the Magnificat. You know, I was hearing somebody playing Mary Did You Know? Mary Did You Know? Read Mary, listen to the song Mary Did You Know, and go read the Magnificat. Luke 1 begins, I think, at verse 43. Somewhere in there, go read the Magnificat, and you'll see exactly what Mary knew. Mary knew a lot, but they didn't believe they were saved by keeping the law. The faithful Jews were waiting for the Savior, the Messiah. It was about faithful loyalty to God, is what all this stuff fell under the umbrella of for them. But they were still observing Passover. They were still going to the temple to pray. We see the apostles doing that in the first chapters of Acts, thinking that these people were going to change. As I said, it's during the Christmas season now, right? What would it take for us to give up our traditions with Christmas as far as food and festival and celebration and decoration and all of that? It's part of who we are. It's part of what we do. Now, if at one time you weren't a believer and now you are a believer, you probably view all of it differently than you did before. You have a deeper understanding, a real appreciation, right? But we're not going to give up those things that are part of who we are. They define us. And the Jewish believers could still hold on to those things and understand them in a more complete way. For them, man, the Passover lamb came and he fulfilled all of this. How awesome is that? But they weren't going to quit celebrating it. Now, when did that happen, that they quit observing and celebrating it? Maybe 70 AD when Jerusalem got leveled. Maybe. All the Christians left before Jerusalem got leveled. By the way, they saw Titus and his armies and they heard Jesus talking about not one stone being left upon another, and they got out. But at that point, did things definitely change? Quite likely. But we're in this, I call it a weird period of history from our perspective, maybe even from theirs. A weird period of history where you've got these people for whom the fabric of their lives was interwoven, defined by these cultural things, and they weren't just going to walk away from it. Because Jesus came. They would have thought that bizarre. They would have looked at you like you'd gone crazy if you suggested it. And you notice, Paul doesn't speak back against this. Now, was Paul probably more open about these things out farther away in Philippi and Thessalonica and might have dealt with them a little bit more directly? Yeah, but he wasn't against them. You can read Galatians. He was definitely against those saying that you had to be circumcised in order to be saved. He theologically clubs them with the truth about that, but that's a different thing. These believers here in Jerusalem didn't think they had to do these things to be saved. They recognized Jesus as their Savior. And if Jesus is your Savior, then these things can't add to it. But it helped them appreciate it, and it was part of who they were. Now, one thing I want to point out here is they're zealous for the law. They're zealous for the word, for their culture, for their traditions. But they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. The translation here is fine. I'm just going to say this. In the Greek, it's much more forceful. This forsake, the root of that word is right here. Apostasian, apostasy, apostatize from the faith. That's what that word means. In Greek, this is much more forcefully worded than it comes across in English. They were receiving messages that basically Paul was warring against all these things. like an iconoclast, in the Reformation. Bust these things up, throw away all the images, all the artwork, destroy it all. There was that part of the Reformation, the radical Reformation. And Paul wasn't doing anything like that. Well, we're going to see where they get this message from, because the people who had been believers, or not believers, people from the different cities where Paul had ministered, they were back for the festival. They were back. Some of them were there, and they're the ones who were going to see Paul in the temple and cause problems. So the information the Christian Jews in Jerusalem had received had come from the opponents of Paul's ministry, who'd stirred up all the trouble in the different places where he had been. So they're hearing that he's just saying, death to the Passover, do away with all of it. If you circumcise your children, you're damned eternally. Who knows what they were hearing? And Paul was still a Jew too. These things were part of his experience. He wanted to get back for the feast. He wanted to be here for it. They lived in a different world than you do. That's an important concept. You want to understand history? Understand that. The people who lived in the United States in the 1800s, they lived in a different world than you. And if you don't put in the effort to understand the way they viewed things, the things that shaped their perspective, you're going to miss a lot of it. You're going to misinterpret a lot of it. We need to get our heads around who these people were and the time they lived in and understand it. Don't judge it, understand it. It was different. And you'll notice Paul gives no resistance. And we know Paul, he takes Peter to task in the book of Galatians. He recounts that when Peter came and acted the hypocrite, Paul let him have it in front of everybody. Paul's got no problems standing up for what he believes. Here, he's fine with it. He'll go do this. He'll go the vow, and these were probably Nazirite vows that these guys had taken. We're not going to jump into that at length. These 4 men who were under a vow, take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Not going to get into the details of what they had to do, but there were ceremonies, things that had to be done, offerings that had to be made for their vows to be counted as completed. And we can't even get our minds around that. What's that about? Different world, different place, different time. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself live in observance of the law. So they've been hearing he doesn't want anybody to have anything to do with this stuff. Well, he's going to walk into the temple and participate in it and show everybody. And there was nothing wrong in what Paul was doing. He wasn't wimping out here because now he's home and he was being careful what he was saying. None of that. There is no hypocrisy here, no duplicity. He's just being a believing Jew. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, this is James going back. That Jerusalem council's really important. You had this thing where these believers from all these different faiths, heathen faiths, were coming into the fold, and there had to be some guidelines there, because the things they did to worship when they were heathens, the things that went on were wrapped up with version, drinking blood, all kinds of things. So some guidelines had to be set, and James goes back to that and refers to that. But then Paul took them in the next day. He purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them. So he's going in, make an announcement to whoever, I don't know, the bureaucracy of vows and things. I have no idea. Don't know how it went. It was a priest, no doubt, that they went, or a Levite, they went and reported these things to. It was part of their culture and their faith and what they did. Maybe a good point of comparison for us is, if you're Protestant especially, and you look at Eastern Orthodox worship and you go, man, what is all that about? That doesn't make any sense to me at all. Well, they worship in a completely different way. They really do. I know my dad, when he was in seminary, took us kids one Sunday morning and we went to an Eastern Orthodox Mass, a Greek Orthodox Mass, and it was 2 hours long. It was the longest church service I've ever been through in my life because none of it was in English. It was really quite the show. It was impressive, but hey, I was 8, lost interest about 8 and 10. But they can worship that way. It's perfectly legitimate. It's part of their faith tradition, and it has meaning to them. And all the symbolism and all that stuff's quite fast. It's not for me. Same thing here. They're believers. They do it differently. There isn't a right and there isn't a wrong. Now we're going to deal with what happens, because the theme continues. Everywhere he goes, there is opposition. And we don't see Paul whine. We don't see Paul complain. We talked about the fact that as he was returning home, what did he know? What was everyone telling him? Every prophet on every street corner telling him, hey, don't go there. Bad things are going to happen. And Paul knew that he was supposed to go there, and he was going to face whatever it was that might come. Okay. When the 7 days were almost completed, so they made the announcement they got 7 days, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple. Now, where's Asia? It's not Hong Kong. Asia, grab a map. Asia's right here. Ephesus, right in here. Remember he talked about fighting wild beasts in Ephesus, etc.? Believers from right here, believers, Jews from right there, Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, men of Israel, help. This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place, for they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Okay, the temple. It's always about the temple. Back with Stephen, it was about the temple. The temple, the temple, the temple. It comes up again and again. But they see him. They're from, let's just call it Ephesus, Asia. And they see Paul, and they'd seen him in the city with Trophimus. If they'd seen him in the city with Trophimus, do you think, with what we've seen, with what we have as a track record for the interaction of the Jews who rejected Jesus and the gospel and the apostle Paul, do you think they were laying in wait, that they were in the temple saying, when he shows up, we're going to create a riot. We're going to get him arrested. Who knows what can happen? We're here in Jerusalem. We can get this guy put to death. There's disagreements, and then there's this. There's looking at things differently, and then there's all out hatred and antipathy toward the gospel. And remember, and if you get this truth, it helps understand a lot of things. There is no neutral reaction to Jesus Christ. There is none. You either love him or you hate him. You love him and accept him through faith, or you hate him and reject everything that he's about. That is the truth as it is presented to us in the scriptures. And we see it play out the whole book of Acts. The story repeats again and again and again. The Gospels warring against Jesus himself. But they saw him, and they're just assuming he's brought Greeks into the temple, and they don't care. Because once you get a mob started, and man, I've got the Temple of Artemis over here on the right, just kind of randomly. But the temple, that big, beautiful place built by King Herod, took 46 years. That big, beautiful structure, bringing Gentiles into the temple. I don't know that we have a cultural comparison that we could use, something that would convey how horrid that was. Now, believing Gentiles, there was a place for them in the temple courts outside, okay? Just like there was a place for women. Women weren't allowed in the temple. It was only men. But once they make this cry, put this out there, they knew what the result would be. No one was going to be investigating. They were just going to come after him, that he had defiled this holy place, where they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city and supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then, notice what it says. All the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple at once, and the gates were shut. They were going to make sure he didn't get back in. And those gates, they were huge. They were impressive, and they shut with a mighty bang. And as they were seeking to kill him, what were they going to do? What was their goal? What did they have in mind? They were going to kill him. And chances are, in all honesty, the temple, this is the allegation, the temple had been violated. Unbelievers were brought into the temple. If he got stoned on the street, yeah, the Romans might have investigated and looked into it and Somebody might have gotten in some trouble, but nothing real serious. They could have stoned him out there on the street, and that would have been it. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. They stopped what? Beating Paul. Now, the main point here is they were hitting him. There were thousands of people and they were hitting him. The good news is only so many people can hit you if you're surrounded by a crowd, but you might get crushed. Just that alone could have done Paul in. But look at what happens. Who all comes? The tribune of the cohort, meaning he's the overall commander of all Jerusalem. He heard it was in confusion, and he at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. So this is like instant deployment of the riot police, right? They run in and they stop beating him, okay? But we have to view that as a God thing, that they got there that quickly, that they heard about it. And the Romans, this was one thing, police are always, going to come down on chaos and mobs, because in a chaos, in mobs, in riots, anything can happen. Nothing good happens in a riot. Riots are against the law. Riots are always problems. And the Romans were all about order. They weren't going to allow anyone to riot, because this tribune, had this riot got out of control, would have been in serious trouble. They take it very seriously. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another, and as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, for the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him." Does that sound familiar? We've got everything here. We've got steps. We've got away with him. What if it said after that, "Give us Barabbas"? Yeah, familiar, isn't it? But he comes, he arrests him, 2 chains. I mean, there's some absurdity here, right? Like Paul is some terrible threat. They bind him with 2 chains, and he tries to find out what's going on, what's happening. And there's no presumption of innocence here. They just arrested him and were hauling him away. And they were going to take him to the barracks. They were going to get him out of there. And it tells us the degree of the chaos that existed here, because they wanted to get him out of there because of the violence of the crowd. Even with the soldiers there was danger. And that's the scary thing about a mob, about riots. There's, no matter what, the cops, think of today, the cops have their shields, they've got their clubs, they've got their helmets, they've got mace, they've got whatever else, tear gas, but there are 200 of them and 20,000 rioters. It can go really badly, really quickly. And what the aftermath is, if there's some justice meted out as a result of it, that's fine, but you're still dead, okay? That was, we need to make sure, and I'm going through this in this way, to make sure we appreciate the severity, the peril of what's going on here, the situation that these Roman soldiers were in, and Paul, especially Paul, because they wanted to kill him. How big of a deal was violating the temple? They wanted to kill him. That's how big of a deal that it was. All right. And I could go on. The challenge with this section is it just kind of all goes on, rolls one thing into the other, but I don't want to start the next part. We'll save that when Paul goes to speak. We'll save that for next time. And then all of the intrigue with the plots and scheming of the Jews trying to get him and get him in their power, because Rome has now stepped in. Rome has stepped in. Keep that in mind. Rome ruled the world. Rome has stepped in. Paul is eventually going to appeal to whom and go where? This has become a Rome thing at this point. Once that tribune came, interceded, and rescued Paul, arrested him, whatever you call it. They don't know what they're doing yet. They have no idea what's going on and who this guy is. We'll see that as we continue. But there has been a turn here, and it's an important one. This has gone from being a Jewish persecution thing that will continue, but it's now a Rome thing. and that changes everything. Well, I hope that this has been interesting. A whole lot of information here, but a whole lot of things that we've had to kind of break down and get into so that we understand it better. And I hope that this study, this ongoing study here in the book of Acts, is a blessing to you. If it is, do those things that help us out. Give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, share this video with others. Drop by and see us at our website. We've got all our Bible teachings there. You can find them as well as other resources, but that is decodingthedeception.com. Drop in and pay us a visit. This is Matthias 76. Together, we are decoding the deception. God bless and have a great day.